So today I'm going to talk about early aggressive parenteral, intravenous, and enteral nutrition of the preterm infant. In general, each of these is an hour or two long talk, but today we're condensing it down to one talk. And on my slides I do have my email address because I know it is difficult to get so much information. And if you have questions or would like me to send you related articles, please do so. Sometimes it takes me a while to get back, but I think that it's difficult to capture all the information at these talks. Okay. Today I'm going to talk about the rationale for what we call early aggressive nutrition. And one of my partners and I were the first people to use that term, early aggressive nutrition. You'll now see it commonly used, and I'm still not sure exactly what it means, but I think it means pushing the limits of nutrition to try to get babies to grow. So we're going to talk about early parenteral nutrition, review the risks and benefits of early enteral nutrition, and discuss why we need a combined parenteral and enteral approach to achieve successful early aggressive nutrition. Okay, so we define early aggressive nutrition as a combination of both parenteral and enteral nutrition, and both of them should be started as quickly as possible after birth. And ideally, we want to give nutrient delivery in amounts that it's safe and beneficial. Now, why do we want to give early aggressive nutrition? Well, clearly you've heard some of that from the speakers over the last few days. But nationally and internationally, current feeding strategies are producing after birth postnatal growth failure that is not reversed by the time of hospital discharge. And you've all seen this slide several times showing the evidence for postnatal growth retardation. And this is one of the first large examples to come out that studied over 1,500 infants. And clearly, a lot of these infants are growth retarded by the time they go home from the hospital. So can this pattern of postnatal growth retardation be reversed in our practices? Very preterm infants have minimal nutritional reserves. Once a preterm infant develops growth failure, it is very hard to reverse that growth failure. And unfortunately, there are few data regarding how to avoid early postnatal malnutrition, let alone how to reverse existing growth failure. And today I'm really concentrating on the very preterm infants, but a lot of what we talk about will also extend to the more mature infant. So, in our unit, we consider a very preterm newborn to be a nutritional emergency. They have glucose stores of only about 200 kcals, and they very quickly become catabolic, which is defined as a net protein loss. With intravenous glucose alone, these babies will lose up to 1% of their body protein stores per day. And this is significant that when you consider one of the definitions of protein malnutrition is a 10% loss of protein stores. So this is an example of protein losses in infants who receive only intravenous glucose. And this is a series of 3 studies done over 1996 to 1997. The first study was in term infants. This is gestational age, and this is gram per kilo per day of nitrogen loss. So term infants lose about 0.5 gram per kilo per day if you don't give them any extra protein. At 32 weeks, these babies, starting from the first day of life, will lose up to 1 gram per kilo per day. But the younger you get in gestation, and here this represents 26 weeks, these babies are losing up to 1.5 grams per kilo per day of protein if we don't give them some other source of protein. So the big question is, how much protein can you give, how quickly, and how can it be safe? And a lot of this still has to be worked out, but I think enough people have a consensus on how they administer protein that there's a fairly common practice, but again, with many as yet unanswered questions. One of the questions is, how can we tell if we're giving too much protein? And Dr. Ziegler yesterday warned us that yes, there's a lot of benefit to early protein, but in fact there may be some downsides. So unfortunately, the markers that we have to determine if there is parental amino acid intolerance include metabolic acidosis, but as all of you who take care of tiny infants know, these infants can have acidosis for many reasons, not just related to protein intake. They may have high ammonia concentrations, and some people think this is probably the best thing to measure, but again, it's not very practical because it takes a lot of blood and it's difficult to do. Most commonly worldwide, people probably follow the blood urea nitrogen level as a marker of getting too much protein. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And a final marker that a lot of people use would like to use are abnormal plasma amino acid levels. Are we, by giving protein, getting certain amino acids that rise to such a high level in the blood that they could be detrimental to both brain growth and potentially physical growth? So unfortunately, reliable and sensitive markers of amino acid intolerance still need to be defined. So just briefly, I'm going to tell you about a study that we did, which we called the low versus high amino acid intake study, and we hypothesized that very low birth weight infants in the first 1 to 2 days of life, if we had a group receiving low amino acids, and at that time low was 1 gram per kilo per day, versus high, 3 grams per kilo per day. And when we did this study that started in 2000 and was published in 2003, virtually nobody was using a protein intake at that time. So the higher protein intakes that you see have really come about since the year 2000. And we hypothesized that the higher intake would be more efficacious in terms of improving protein growth and safe with no significant abnormal markers, at least that we had talked about. So just briefly, this was a small study. Babies were about 945 grams, 27 weeks. They'd been on TPN for a day or a day and a half by the time we actually got the study going. And there's significantly more amino acids given to the higher intake group, though clearly not as much as we'd like. And glucose and lipid intake were similar in the two groups. And we looked at our protein balance outcome, or protein growth outcome, by two methods. One is a nitrogen balance method, where you measure the protein that goes in and the protein that comes out of the baby. And our higher intake group here in purple showed that the nitrogen balance, or nitrogen gain, in these babies in the first few days of life was almost 1 gram per kilo per day. And by this technique, some of these babies were actually a little bit catabolic. And then we measured it by a stable isotope method, which gave same overall general results in that these babies that getting 3 grams per kilo per day of protein could actually be anabolic and gaining weight within the first day or two of life. Again, trying to avoid that early protein malnutrition. And I just want to show you this slide in that the question came up, how do we decide if we're giving too many amino acids and getting high amino acid levels that could potentially be toxic? And there are reference data out there in the literature. Most people have thought that the ideal amino acid levels would be that of the term 1-month-old baby on breast milk. And that's used commonly as a standard reference. However, clearly in our preterm infants that doesn't apply very well. So we sought another comparison group that would help us decide, are we having a dangerous practice or a safe practice? And so fortunately we did some work with people in Milan, Italy, where the obstetricians frequently sample umbilical cord blood samples, chordocentesis. And from that they could get the amino acid levels that were present in babies, and they were able to get it over a range of gestational ages. So we decided to use this data, thinking that perhaps Mother Nature would not allow a baby in utero to get amino acid levels that were too high. So these were the black represents amino acid levels for the essential amino acids in our high intake group. The blue line bar represents fetal second trimester amino acid concentrations done by Arenacitine and colleagues. And the red bar represents fetal third trimester amino acid concentrations. And we found this data reassuring in that in all cases, virtually all cases, our high intake group had amino acid levels for all the essential amino acids that were lower than that seen in the fetus. So we were probably not getting excessively high. or at least we hope. So the conclusions of this study were that we could really start amino acids in the first day of life and be anabolic, or laying down protein, with 3 grams per kilo per day, and that the lower intake group was still minimally anabolic, but was clearly showing greater protein balance than had been previously demonstrated. Now I want to point out that we have many colleagues who have done similar studies over the years, and this is just a partial list of studies. This is the study list with different investigators and the year of investigation, and the amino acid solutions that were used in each of these investigations. And when you look at all of these together, none of these studies have demonstrated toxicity is determined by increased incidence of metabolic acidosis or elevated BUN. So what should be the upper and lower limits of intravenous amino acid intakes? So we feel that at least the minimum amount of amino acid intake should be that which gives you a zero balance, not catabolic. And in general, this can be achieved with as little as 1 to 1.5 grams per kilo per day of amino acids. But the upper limit of parenteral amino acid intake is still, the desirable level is still unknown and still under investigation, and there's a lot of controversy over this issue. Dr. Ziegler has been very helpful in my career in helping me decide what protein intakes I should give infants of different gestational ages. And if I interpret what he's told me correctly, that as yet we still need to try and decide what is the upper limit of intake, and again, it'll be defined by limiting concerns of toxicity. But in general, these are the guidelines that I have used. At 24 to 25 weeks, this is the protein intake. 27 to 28 weeks, this intake. 32 weeks, and term infant.